Today, I will be responding to the claim that violence shown on television has an impact on the aggressive behavior in children. The advocates claim to support this were that young minds are very vulnerable to violence and that television teaches violent actions as acceptable. My proposal is that the violence shown on television does not actually cause the aggressive behavior in children. I will prove this by showing that even though young minds are vulnerable to violence, not all children are affected in the same manner or react to the media violence in the same way, and that although children's underdeveloped minds might cause them to believe that the violence on the television shows are acceptable, that doesn't mean that they won't learn otherwise as they grow up and then not be affected by it. The reason that children's minds are vulnerable to violence is because their brains are not as fully developed as adult brains, and this was explained by the advocate. For this reason, it is true that it is difficult for most children to understand the difference between fiction and what is true, but not all children's brains develop in the same manner. According to the investigators at Washington University of Medicine in St. Louis, children activate different regions of their brains as they do different activities, and because all children are different, all their brains are affected differently by other things, which include violence. There are also other factors that could be taken into consideration as to how media violence affects a certain child more than another child. For example, in the article, The Effects of Television Violence on Children by Dale Kunkel, which was one of the advocates' own sources, Kunkel mentions that most researchers of aggression agree that aggression and violent behavior does not usually occur unless there are other factors which could be psychological abnormalities, poor child rearing, social deprivation, poor peer relations, or other factors. Richard Tremblay, a psychologist and pediatrician from the University of Montreal, was also quoted in this article, and he mentions that it's normal for aggressive behaviors to be found in children from the age of 2 to around 5 years old, and these aggressive behaviors just spontaneously appear, or they could also be known as temper tantrums. Another of the advocates' claim as to why violence on television has an impact on the aggressive behavior of children is for the reason that they imitate the actions of other characters. It is true that children might imitate characters from a violent media, but that doesn't mean that the media, or that's what causes the violence. The advocate mentions a study where elementary school children are split into groups to watch a violent show like Power Rangers or a neutral show, and she states that in the experiment, the children watching Power Rangers after they become more aggressive by kicking or screaming more than the children who watch the neutral show. And this is not an accurate study. Just because the study attempted to have control groups doesn't mean that they succeeded in having those control groups. It doesn't mean that all the children were the same to begin with. The advocate made it clear that the children imitate the actions of characters by citing expert testimony in some articles, and this means that these studies with violent and non-violent shows are not as accurate as they may seem, because not all the critical factors were considered in the study. She also mentioned that the study took place in 1995, which was almost 15 years ago, and this was during a time when corporal punishment was more common in the U.S., which it isn't as common today, and this shows that because these children, she claims, are imitating the actions of others, they could have easily have been imitating the actions of a family member or a friend at school or a sibling, and not from the television show. Because children's brains are not fully developed and they cannot tell the difference from right or wrong, or real or not, you may say that the violence is taught by the television, and that they they learn that violent actions are acceptable. But even if the children do learn the violence from the television, that doesn't mean that they're not going to learn from their parents what's right or wrong, or from society as they grow up, and therefore it won't affect them in the future.
All right, Elyana, you're using primarily counterclaims on causality on most of your supporting points. I thought that you did an okay job signposting as you got to the points. You kind of repeat what the advocate's claim is indirectly, and then provide some evidence or interpretation of the advocate's evidence on those points. For instance, on the first point, you do cite some evidence that talks about brain activity, although it does sound to me like that evidence would suggest that if their activity was watching something aggressive, that that's the way they would be affected. So I'm not sure it really undermines the claim that you're making there. The other argument I thought was a little bit more relevant, and that you took the quote from the advocate's source, gives it more credibility that other factors are required in order to trigger any of this, and so attributing it solely to the exposure to violence on television is problematic. I like that. And then you've also got an argument that says, look, kids are aggressive, that happens, and I thought that that was fine. You also need to context there. The fact that kids are aggressive doesn't necessarily mean that there's a negative consequence to it. By the time they're adolescents, for instance, are they engaged in criminal activity or doing anything dangerous? I think that's a reasonable question. Clear transition to the second point. Your challenge on that point is to the study that the advocate presented, but you don't have any reason to doubt the study. You just said, well, just because they claimed that they had control groups doesn't mean it was really controlled. Well, just because you pointed that out doesn't mean that it wasn't. You're the one who's making the claim. They've claimed that they've done this, and they provided a study that gave you criteria on this. You need some reason to suggest that it isn't really controlled. And then you raise the issue of other factors, and I thought that that was kind of an interesting one. Although it's largely asserted on your part that corporal punishment was more widely used in the past, I think you need some data on that to suggest that that's true. Or, for instance, I think there's probably a good argument to be made that maybe they are modeling the corporal punishment that they get from their family, and you need to say maybe the studies didn't account for this in the process, or that there is a causality here, and this is the more likely causality, and provide some evidence on that. I thought the last point skimped a little bit. Your pacing's a little awkward, and your exit was a bit abrupt. All right. Thank you.